Who's practicing? Good morning. This is Dr. Oba T'Shaka, and I see we have one person already on the chat, Wolf Menlui. Hello. Robin Hughes, right on. This is like a very special show. All of them are special, but this one is real special because I've been building up to this one since I started the show. And so the topic for today's show is proposing a webinar to heal our spirits through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. The topic is proposing a webinar to heal our spirits through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. This has been like the real foundation for this show. And I've been building up to this. And in this, you're going to get the method for healing, which goes through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And I'll be proposing a webinar that is being extensive, meaning it'll go on for a particular period of time, separate from this show. And that's necessary because this is a transformational thing. This is not just information. So this is the real purpose of this show is to prepare you for a webinar that will go over a period of time separate from the time of this show. And it will engage people in some real deep healing around African identity and Black identity. So that's the real purpose of this show. I want to announce that next Saturday on the 26th of June, Professor Kaba Hiawatha Kamene will be my guest, and we'll engage in a dialogue, and the dialogue will be on the Anu. He's just come up with a book called The Shabaka Stone. If you get a chance to push that book. He also opens the book with the conclusions that I reached in the integration trap about how central the Twa or Anu are to world civilization and to African civilization. So we're going to have a nice discussion. I've known Kamene for many years, and I'm proud of the work that he does to wake our people up and to make a contribution to humanity at large. The following Saturday, you're going to get a special treat. It's going to be a show with my sister, Sondrea Bradley. My slave name was Bill Bradley. And my sister is a spirit lady. She's a poet. She's the best poet in our family. My grandmother was a poet. My mother was a poet. I'm a poet. My sister's the master poet. I'm an amateur. She'll even tell me. She's a practicing, among many things, astrologer. So what we're going to be doing next Saturday is having a discussion on the Kemetic basis for astrology, because that's where it came from, its connection to astronomy, but particularly how does it work for you to understand the person, which when we went through the God Within series, that's the Ka, your destiny. How does it help for you to understand that? Because basically your birth chart is your destiny footprint that you picked in heaven. That's really it. And I've been doing astrology since 1969. So is she, but she's earned a living through it. This has been one of the things she does. She's a healing woman. So she's into a lot of different things. She's my younger sister. So we've been preparing this for a while, and I just got her approval to be on for the 3rd of July. So this is going to be a real treat. And for me, this took a while for me to do this because when I first started teaching at San Francisco State, I wouldn't talk about astrology. It was maybe 2 or 3 years before I started doing that. And that was because I know how people react to astrology. It's mumbo jumbo. It's a joke. And had you asked me before my sister's godmother, who happened to be Mexican American, her name was Addie, a very nice woman. Her mother was a close friend of my mother. She lived up the hill from where we live in the Bernal Heights. She did a spot chart on me, which is something you can do in about 10 minutes. When I do a chart, it takes about 30 hours. And it basically shows the position of planets at the time you were born. She told me more about myself than my mother knew. So the only way you really get me is you got to prove it works. So that's going to be the next show. And I think you'll enjoy it. And my sister's very smart. And she worked in Pan-African Publishers for 2 years. But I worked for her. She just gave me orders. You know how sisters are, you know what I mean? So, and she did a good job, you know, so she's also into computers. So that will be the following Saturday. So the 26th, next Saturday of June, we'll have Kaba Hiawatha Kamene on, and we'll be dealing with sharing notes on the Twa or the Anu, and then the following Saturday, July the 3rd, my sister, and we'll be talking about what is astronomy astrology, because astrology is based on astronomy. What is it? How does it work? It's not this newspaper stuff. So that's what we'll be doing in the future. So I've actually booked 2 weeks ahead. I'm making some progress here. So this show is for the purpose of launching a year-long webinar to heal our spirits through the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. Some people think they already got this because they've either read 20 pages in the integration trap, or when they bought the integration trap, a few people got the complimentary 40-page thing that I did on the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. And then a few people have checked out a thing that I did when I was working with Philippe Matthews on a 6-day webinar that was free, introducing the 6 stages of consciousness. Well, if you think that is the deal, then you really don't understand what's going on. Because what we're going to be doing through the year-long webinar to heal our spirits through the 6-fold stages to mental freedom is we're going through an experience. And the way African systems work is they're transformational. The way European systems work, they're informational. Now, you'll get information, but they don't transform you. And so the information you got is not transformational. It gives you information, and you're getting it the white way, even though the information is African. I'm going into this later. So this is what this show is about, because the foundation is about transformation. The foundation is about awakening. And I'm only doing this because I wanted to reach a broader group of my people and of humanity at large, but particularly my people. And particularly, I wanted to reach out to the younger generation. So all these other shows have been preparing you for what this will do. This will operate on a different time period at a different time than this show. So that's the real purpose for this show. But this is a good occasion for putting forward the proposal for a webinar to heal our spirits through the sixfold stages to mental freedom, because this is the occasion of Juneteenth. So this is a good occasion for that. And as we've seen, because you led the way to kicking Trump out of the White House and hopefully preparing him for the jailhouse, you got somebody in the White House who did a lot of damage to Black people. But in order to get elected, he had to sing to the choir. He had to pick him a Black female vice president because the sisters were really the strongest force in the Black electoral map that, won him South Carolina. That was the only primary he won, and then elevated him to the front runner without having to challenge anybody. And so whatever you think about him, he's doing some stuff that wouldn't be done but for the fact that you were in the driver's seat and you orchestrated through Black Lives Matter. COVID helped us unseating Donald Trump. And you don't give yourself enough credit for your victories. You're so much into the woe is me, I'm in bad shape modality. I know a lot of people that pipe into the chat aren't, but a lot of our people are, that you miss your strengths. I've always said before, our greatest weakness, African Americans, is that we underestimate our strengths. We are very good in the weaknesses. In fact, we exaggerate them. But when it comes to the strengths, we're short on them. And that's because you're seeing yourself through somebody else's eyes. And that's also a part of what this webinar is going to be about. So the occasion for launching this, it's a good occasion, dealing with Juneteenth and the fact that the Congress and your president had to finally give in to a lot of Black pressure and make it a holiday. We had already made it a holiday, but so it's a holiday right now. But the key point is it's an important date because it represents the formality of emancipation. And of course, the irony that it took so long for it to get to Texas, 2.5 years. The irony, because Texas was the outlier in the Confederacy. It was the furthest removed from the southern states. And so war was not fought on Texas soil. And as a result, a lot of enslavers brought their slaves to Texas as the war was bearing down on their plantations. So this is the occasion officially for the celebration of emancipation. And a lot of Black people are going to downplay this because we didn't get fully free. Yeah, true. But the fact of the matter is, in the Caribbean, every one of those countries has an Emancipation Day. It's important. And as much as there are some Neanderthal whites that would like to put us back on the plantation, those days are over. And what we're dealing with now is getting rid of the plantation mentality. That's what the webinar on Heal Our Spirits with the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom is about. Not that it starts it. We've been involved in this process for a while. So Juneteenth marks the day when Blacks were informed that they were emancipated through General Granger's publishing of Field Order Number 3 that announced the emancipation of Blacks. It's not clear that he actually read it, but the word finally got out. And even in Texas, some people didn't get the word then. And it took a while for some to get it. So this was 2.5 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and 2 months after no good for nothing Robert E. Lee had to surrender at Appomattox. And I'm telling you, Robert E. Lee was not a nice person. He was one vicious slave master, but he was one hell of a general. And I'll get into how he was whipped, you know what I mean, in a minute, because the other side of me is warrior, and I study war, so there will be no war no more, once we have justice. So Robert E. Lee surrenders, admits his military defeat 2 months before the Emancipation Proclamation is read in Texas. Now, according to my family tree, and in family reunions, my family has actually laid out its family tree, and it would take up, my study is 400 square feet. The length of it would take up the length of the study. It goes back to 1865, and it goes back to my earliest recorded ancestor, who's my namesake in my slave name. His name was William Henry Bradley. He lived in Virginia, the same place where Lee surrenders. That's where a lot of my people were. And my father's, so we on the family tree, he's at the top, and it's William Henry Bradley, 1865, Virginia. My father was named William Henry Bradley Sr., and in the San Francisco Freedom Movement, I was known as Bill Bradley, but of course that's short from William Henry Bradley Jr. And my father added pride to that name. He was one fighting Black man, and I tried to, but I had to change my name, Oba T'Shaka. I had to change my name. This emancipation, in terms of my family, traces back. The surrender occurs where my people were, so I know how they reacted to it. But then I have a great aunt, and she lived in Sacramento, California. She was over 100 years of age, and her name was Juvena Bradley. She's over 100 years old. And in her family Bible, she left the record of where my people come from in Africa. This ain't on the family tree, but every time we have a family reunion, I make sure they insert it and put it up there, because when they compiled this, they didn't know this. And she noted that my ancestors come from Madagascar, which is an island off of East Africa. I may have mentioned this before, but a few years before my mother died, she had a great memory. And we were going across the Bay Bridge, and I just, these all of a sudden, questions, they're usually the most important ones you ask. And so I said, Mom, do you remember what part of Africa our people came from? And she said, Mada. I said, Madagascar? Yes. Well, so that means that on my father's side of the family, my people come from Madagascar. It also means from my mother's side of the family, my people come from Madagascar. And then by way of Mississippi, because on my mother's side, my grandmother, great-grandmother, they're in Mississippi, the hellhole of Mississippi. So that's rare, because Blacks came into this country from Madagascar only during the early period of enslavement around the 1700s. So when I'm relating to Juneteenth, I'm reminded of my family, and I'm sure you are of yours. So even though we can all say, and this is true, what comes after, particularly the period after the end of slavery, Reconstruction, it's a kind of new slavery. It will lead us to say, well, yeah, therefore Juneteenth ain't that important, so what? No, it's very important. Because through an accident of history, because whites never really planned for any emancipation, no Supreme Court came up with an edict on it. It wasn't that the country had a conscience and suddenly they said slavery's evil. No, that didn't happen. It was through the circumstances of history, and particularly the role that we played in it, that this occurred. And it's our role that I really want to stress, because this role is usually missed. And this is it's missed by Blacks. And that's including a lot of African-centered people. So the key thing to realize is that the Emancipation Proclamation was only issued as the North was on the verge of losing the Civil War. This is why it was issued. Remember what Lincoln said, if I can win the war without freeing a single Black, I will. If I can win the war by freeing just a few, I will. And if the only way I can win it is by freeing all of them, I will. Now, he was against slavery, but he was not an abolitionist, a typical liberal, who doesn't put their practice where their mouth is. So emancipation wasn't something that came from the kindness of old Abe's heart. It came from self-interest, political, economic, military self-interest, because what was happening is the great big bad Britain, which was the most powerful nation on the planet, it ruled the waves for 300 years. Britain was on the verge of recognizing the South. And this was serious, because if they threw their weight behind the South, the North would lose, because they would throw their economic weight. And that would give the South tremendous military resources. The North had an industrial machine to make their guns and stuff, to equip their soldiers and everything else. The South's machine was us, you know what I mean? And so it was skimpy. But if Britain came in, they get guns, they get everything you could think of, and probably British intervention. And I'm sure the British motive wasn't for the South to win, it was for them to intervene and for them to get the power they tried to get back in the War of 1812 and that they lost in the War of 1776, launched them. So what happens when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he then inspires the British working class to do something that white working classes have very rarely done, to stand on the side of enslaved Blacks in this country. And they made it clear they would not stand for their aristocracy and their mercantile elite, their growing capitalist elite, to support the South. They were on the side of emancipation. And I think the groundwork that people like Frederick Douglass and others did, traveling to Britain, talking about the system of slavery, helped. And that's not to clear the British. I mean, this system was set up by them. So this was the main motive. One was to prevent Britain from recognizing the South, though Lincoln could not anticipate that the working class would side with Blacks. He couldn't anticipate that. That was an unintended consequence. But of course, the main reason that Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation is because he can't win the war without us. And I'm going to really make this one real clear. So Blacks don't just make a contribution to the Civil War, militarily and otherwise, but Blacks brought into the United States, and for Africans in the Caribbean and South America, into the Western Hemisphere, a set of fighting traditions, as well as a highly advanced system of education, which is in part what we're going to be drawing from in the webinars that we'll be launching later if you're interested in it. So these fighting traditions really lay the foundations for a lot of what happens with Black involvement in the Civil War. And these fighting traditions come out of secret societies. I'm a specialist on secret societies. Most of us have not studied African secret societies during enslavement. Carter G. Woodson is one of our few scholars who noted that it was one of the institutions that continued in the United States. For all of you that said slavery destroyed our culture, like hell, we had to recreate one here, but and one of the key institutions that we brought over was secret societies, and slave masters were not aware of them because they're secret. And guess what? Black people good at keeping secrets. Some of us have lost that ability now. Some of us watching too much TV and everything, and we just give up everything. But most of us, we're pretty good at secrets. And I'll tell you, the Caribbean African is even more secretive because they're more African traditional than us. They are into secrets. And it was an observation of enslavers that said, the African is by nature secretive. Yes, you hear me? And the secret societies of Africa were educational centers. These educational centers had to be created as secret societies as the Europeans began to come into Africa with their slave trade and later colonialism. So the elders had to preserve African culture through these secret societies. And I'm going to talk about P.A.P.O, the highest educational system in the world in ancient Kemet in a minute, which meant House of Life, highest university system. This grew out of the secret societies of Africa. And these secret societies were transformational. And so these were societies that trained young Africans, particularly between teenage years through 30, in all of the culture, and particularly in the arts of war. Now, in ancient Kemet, the P.A.P.O did not train warriors. The Pharaoh did. But in African secret societies, they trained warriors. Some of the baddest warriors you could lay your eyes on. So some of these secret societies, one of which played a prominent role during enslavement, was the Loyal League, Loyal, the Loyal League. Prince Hall's African Lodge, which later got called Prince Hall's Masons. And there were many others. And I've studied a lot of these secret societies that pop up at the end of slavery. And they're not just the ones hidden off in the Masons and Elks, but they're independent ones with hundreds of thousands of members that helped us build up Black communities at the end of slavery. Secret societies were really the basis for institution building among our people. And insurance companies basically came out of those. Multi-$100 million insurance companies coming out of burial societies because Africans believe very much in life after death. So these secret societies, especially among others, including the Loyal League, had members on the plantation and among so-called free men and women of color. And they were dedicated to the overthrow of slavery by any means necessary. And they would provide the launching pad for much of the military activity that Blacks would participate in the Civil War. Secret societies were spirit political organizations. They operated on the principle of praise the Lord and pass the ammunition when it's the right time. They were fighters. When Nat Turner carried out the most successful slave rebellion in the US, and then later was captured, he was viewed by the Loyal League, the secret societies, as a great hero, as he was among enslaved Blacks in general. He was referred to as a him-be. And when we get into the system for the webinars, which you'll only really get when you go through them, because they're not just informational, they're transformational. They are him-be systems. In other words, him be what he preaches. That was Nat Turner. He was a him-be African who preached in the tradition of Africa and who was inspired by the Spirit. The Spirit came to him, showed him blood on the leaf, visited him and told him, God is telling him he must stand up for justice. He must make a stand against enslavement. This was his inspiration. Now, people call him a Christian. He was a nominal Christian, kind of like Sundiata was, or Sundiata in the great empire of Mali. He was a nominal Muslim. He was really a traditionalist. And most historians of Mali, that's what they say. And so that's kind of the case with General Nat Turner, as he was properly referred to. He was a spirit man. He had some little Bible background, but he was basically off into the spirit. The spirit of Africa drove him. So when he makes his stand, old Nat Turner, he's viewed as a warrior hero among enslaved Africans and the warriors in the secret society, because all the secret society members were warriors. He was a model for them. And for them, because the way the African mind works, he was making a demonstration. This was more than an insurrection. This was a demonstration. Check this out, because we often don't get this. No movements for liberation of Black folks in this country have been successful unless it's had two ingredients: the spirit and a successful or a sensible, reasonable political, economic, social program. But generally, it's had to have both. And so when you look at General Nat Turner, he saw himself as demonstrating the power of God. You hear me? We've had all these shows about the power of God within you. These Africans knew that. Some of us who moved away from that. And if we want to talk about healing, it's going back to the old time stuff, because these enslaved Africans were Africans first. That's why many second and third generation Africans, when they came in contact with saltwater Africans, first ones to arrive on the boat, they would call them full of African courage. And usually John Henry Clark, the reason why he took the roadway to Africa in his scholarship was because his grandmother told him about her husband, Buck, who was a bad African, who took no mess from white people. That's what inspired John. That was African courage. You hear me? And when you see yourself as an African, you have that same kind of courage. In fact, fear won't even be in your vocabulary. You will eliminate it. You hear me? It goes out the window, because as I said before, fear is a myth. It is the greatest obstacle to your spiritual growth. Wherever you have fear, someone else has control over you. The hell with fear. Fear is the boogeyman. There's a lot of boogeymans. I won't touch on them because some of them will be stepping on too many toes. So Nat Turner saw himself and enslaved Africans, and especially the members of secret societies, saw Nat Turner as demonstrating the power of God. And then again, remember this, the Africans always, when they thought spiritually on the spirit basis, you call it religion, which they didn't, they would always think of it in terms of sacrifice. There would always be a sacrifice, you know? And so when Nat Turner was captured and killed, then this was viewed by him, by enslaved Africans in general, because they were African in mind, and especially by the secret society members. This was viewed as a sacrifice against the evils of slavery. You hear me? A sacrifice. And a sacrifice endured with no weeping, no moaning. Oh, please don't do it to me. Because he did it to as many of them as he could before he got caught. Because he was striking a blow for liberty for his people, but he was making a statement. And then what was interesting for somebody in between, because most Africans on the plantation were not Christians, but a few were. He was a nominal one, but mainly a spirit man. The fact that he was executed in Jerusalem had a special meaning to Black folks. You hear me? So the key point that I want to make here is that the belief that slavery broke our people is mumbo jumbo. If that's what you want to believe, then your head is still in the plantation and you're really going to need this webinar to free your mind. But I know a lot of you listening right now, you know better, but a lot of us don't, you know, because the majority of Africans on the plantation were spirit soldiers. They were just looking for the right opportunity to strike a blow. If that blow was fast feet and getting away, that was the blow. If that blow was putting some poison in your master's food, that was the blow. If the blow was to get revenge for what old Miss Ann did in whipping an enslaved woman's child, then that's what she did. You hear me? But wherever on the plantation, the master said no, we took the yes position. And when he took the yes position, we took the no position. And if you don't understand that, you don't know the souls of Black folks. So long before the Civil War, Blacks were preparing for the Civil War. Because you see, people coming out of secret societies, some of them, if they came out of the Islamic ones, were erudite, meaning they wrote, but others were highly educated, but they came out of oral societies and their memories were, their minds were libraries. In either cases, they were highly informed, very wise, and they could see ahead. Remember I said about enslavement, a lot of Africans lived outside of time. And those Africans were living in spirit time. And spirit people can also see ahead. And so Africans were plotting where this thing would go before it happened, this Civil War. So we know that David Walker wrote David Walker's Appeal. Those of you that don't know, it's an important book that encouraged slave insurrections, violent ones. But with caution, David Walker said, only strike a blow for freedom when the time is right, meaning don't do it if we don't have a chance of winning. So this was very key. And it's very interesting. David Walker's Appeal was written after he accompanied Colonel Rockman, who had been a plantation manager in Mississippi, had been a colonel in the Fulani Army and was captured and enslaved in Mississippi. And it's only when the slave master wanted to sell his daughter that he petitioned the president of the United States through the King of Morocco, got his freedom, and then traveled to Harvard to lecture on African culture and then went back to Africa. David Walker was accompanying him on that trip. And I think Rockman, who also was an affiliate of secret societies, inspired, or at least was one of the inspirations for David Walker's Appeal. In 1848, one of the Black Convention movements, and these were movements that Blacks held, so-called free men and women of color through the 1800s, debating the issues of ending slavery. And the one in 1848, the convention called for Blacks to organize militias, armed militias. And this is in preparation for a war that would be fought to end slavery. So they wanted to prepare for this. The only place in the United States where Blacks could legally organize militias was in North Carolina. But Blacks organized them in other places. So in South Carolina, Black militia units were armed, and the members of the Black militia units were Loyal League members. And because they couldn't get regular uniforms, they wore red pants and they had a special uniform and they were armed. And they were initially under a brother by the name of Prince Rivers. Prince Rivers. They drilled, they prepared. They were preparing for the war to come. Now, South Carolina organized the best organized rebellion in the history of enslavement, the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion. And that rebellion was very, very thorough in its organization. And Blacks were the majority in South Carolina, so there was a real fear among whites, particularly in South Carolina, of Black resistance. And many Blacks who escaped from South Carolina went to Florida and joined Osceola, fighting with the Seminoles, having two armies, an African army, a Native American army. And this was the only successful war that Native Americans won, and it was the only successful slave revolt that Blacks carried out. The Seminole Wars, those were bad, bad, you hear me? So in Philadelphia, you have a brother named George Stevens. And Stevens organizes a militia. He's the commander when it's organized. And he sends to the governor of Philadelphia a message: we're ready to fight. So this is the key point about this is, get it straight. Abe didn't free your butt. Of course, you still ain't free. But that Emancipation Proclamation, he had to issue that. And in a minute, we'll get into, some of you already know this, we'll get into what it actually covered. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't the Union Army that freed you per se. It was certain people in it. Guess who? So Loyal League members and other secret societies pushed Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Other Blacks were as well. People like Martin R. Delany had been preparing, and he was the most brilliant person we produced in the 19th century. Martin R. Delany, Black nationalist, went to Harvard to get a medical degree, and the white students demanded that he be expelled. He got his medical degree anyway. He was brilliant. He was proud of being Black. And he was one of those plotting the Civil War long before it happened, because these guys were smarter than the people they were going up against. This is common for our people. So there was pressure coming from Blacks for old Abe to sign an Emancipation Proclamation, but Abe was reluctant and would only do it when he felt that he had no other choice. Only when he thought that the only way he could keep the North from losing was to sign it. When he's getting ready to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, old Abe is advised that it's not smart to sign it right now because you haven't had any victories. You've been losing all the time. So if you sign it now, it's going to look like you're reaching out to Ethiopia. Black people, that's what they meant, Ethiopia. The average African-American, even if he wasn't into Christianity, most of them were not, were Ethiopianists. They believed in this passage of the Bible that says, princes shall come forth out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God. And then our scholars added soon. Ethiopia, the one nation in Africa that wasn't colonized and didn't face slavery, was the symbol for freedom for African people. And so Marcus Garvey was an Ethiopianist. He never used the word Pan-Africanist, though he was a practicing Pan-Africanist. He had the largest organization for the freedom of Africa in the world at that time. But he was an Ethiopianist by consciousness. The Rastafarians, Ethiopianists and Pan-Africanists, you know? So Lincoln's advisor says, don't make it look like you're begging the Africans to save you. Wait till you have a victory. So he has Antietam, which he, is able to carve out as a so-called victory. And it's at this point that he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in using this period of Juneteenth to launch this idea of a webinar, this historical background is important because it ties into this whole issue of freeing our minds. Because in the case of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't free Blacks from chattel slavery. We already know the proclamation did not free anybody. It only applied to states in rebellion. It didn't apply to the states that had supported the North that had slaves. It didn't free them. It only applied in areas where Blacks were not free, meaning that Blacks would have to do whatever they could to cut their way loose. So, but the key point is, Lincoln didn't free Blacks. 170,000 Black soldiers, mostly men, but some women, some sisters got in there. And of course, Harriet Tubman was herself a leading spy, and these secret societies themselves were right full of spies. That's one of the roles that the Loyal League and other secret societies played during the Civil War. They were the Union's best intelligence because they were behind enemy lines. They were building up fortifications for the Confederacy and then sending information back on everything they did. You understand? They knew better Robert E. Lee's dispositions, and sometimes he did, and he knew it. And there's nothing he could do about it. But it was 170,000 brothers and some sisters. They got them some trusty Winchester rifles, and then some, in some of these cases, these were these flintlocks, whatever. They got them something to blow old master away. And it was the Black involvement in the war. It's only then that victories began to be chalked up by the Union armies. Until then, they had only had barely any victories. After that, victories after victories. In fact, in the words, I'm quoting a white Alabama planter. This is what he said. He said, listen, this is hard coming out of his mouth. You hear me? He's Neanderthal, racist, Cro-Magnon mouth. Listen to this. He said, the Yankees never could have whooped the South without the aid of the Negroes. That's an understatement. The aid, my butt, 170,000 ain't no aid. We're the ones that fought most fiercely. We weren't deserting. We were going forward. And wherever we could, we were taking them out. So that warrior tradition coming out of secret societies and then passed on from generation to generation, from father and mother to son. And remember, High John the Conqueror, he was like the warrior spirit carried over on slave ships, the spirit of resistance. That was the African man and woman, because the women were trained in secret societies and they were as tough as the men. And that really prepared them for this ordeal, not only of the Middle Passage, but enslavement. Because literally they said, when you went into a secret society, you would die. They meant in one state and be reborn in another. That's the transformation thing. But people going through it thought they would literally die, and some did, because the trials were so rough. Some people didn't live through them. You hear me? And you couldn't marry until you came out of these secret societies. You weren't a man. So it was this spirit that infused the African who picked up the gun and took aim at trusty old master. And then, of course, there were the cases where Blacks got on a plantation and with the Union Army and brought the master out and tied him to a tree and whipped him. Or cases where brothers are walking down the street and somebody calling him a boy, and he's stepping up to him. Now, this is a Union soldier, you know what I mean? Armed too. He's saying, I'm Mr. Call me Mr. You hear me? Huh? Because when you fight for your freedom, there's a transformation that occurs. And by the way, the sixfold stages to mental freedom came out of a fight. A fight. I went through this. Malcolm went through this. Others went through this. You don't get this just by reading a book. You got to be doing some other stuff. So let me tell you something. These Africans who engaged in this victorious struggle, they didn't just free themselves from chattel slavery, a lot of them underwent mental freedom, because it is a profound experience when you're able to lift the chattels, not only off your arms, but off your people and off your minds. And the fight is one of the best ways to free yourself, along with a path of transformation. And their path was, they were still Africans. You hear me? As Zora Neale Hurston, I've quoted her before, said, one of our foremost authorities on African-American culture, she said, the closer Africans got to enslavement, the more African they were. She actually said the closer at that time Negroes got to enslavement, the more African they were in every way, contrary to popular opinion. So this warrior code was real key of these Africans. And by the way, these Africans had certain codes. I have similar code. Kill no women, kill no children. Mine is treat my enemies with respect. Only degrade them if that's the only way I could win. I've never had to do that, but if I had to, Hannibal used that. He would do whatever psychological war he had to do, and sometimes it's degrading his enemy. If it was an enemy that could be provoked, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the African warrior has a high code of honor. And part of that code is you don't hurt women or children. Many Blacks who fought in the Civil War were criticized by white soldiers, and particularly by white historians, for not being good warriors because they didn't kill women and children. Now, Nat Turner did. That was a rebellion, in part Old Testament inspired, so I understand that. But the fact is, most of us had a code that would not permit us to do that. And by the way, Amilcar Cabral that you see in the sunglasses behind me, that was his rule. He killed no women, he killed no children. And that's part of the way in which he encouraged and actually triggered a rebellion in Portugal that overthrew the dictator Salazar. It was after these soldiers had gone in and got whipped by Cabral, but also experienced this humanity compared to their savagery. It caused them to go up against their own leaders. So this was also a part of the African warrior tradition. Don't think you have to stoop to their level to beat them. You do not. And in fact, what's the point of winning if you come out just like him? You know what I mean? Now, one of the most important shows that I've had, because a number of my shows have prepared you for what I'm getting ready to do now, prepare you for getting into the system for transformation. And so a number of different shows have done preparation for that. One was a show that I've retitled. It had a different title when I first did it. It's called How Black Power Produced the Military Defeat of the Confederacy, Segregation, and Trump. I consider this to be one of my two best shows. My cinematographer went in and put historical footage on it. So you see Black Union Army soldiers, you see a variety of things, because it's not only about the Union victory and the Black victory in the Civil War. And it basically argues that Blacks served as the balance of power in the Civil War. We determined the outcome. And so this particular show, which if you haven't watched it, you should, demonstrated this role as Blacks being the decisive factor in the victory, in the outcome, and in Black emancipation, and was key in showing how whites were defeated. I also made the point in this show that there are two major defeats that whites have faced in this country at our hands. One was through the Civil War and the defeat of the Confederacy, and guaranteeing the end of slavery. And I should point out, Loyal League people were very concerned that if the Civil War ended before they engaged before they were involved, slavery may well have continued. And this was a real key concern that Blacks had, particularly Blacks prepared to fight. So they knew they had to be a decisive factor in this to seal the fate of the Confederacy. And so it may well be that some of the Black spies who were spying for the Pinkerton, which happened to be the equivalent of the FBI or CIA, that's all they had then. They were Pinkerton guards that mainly worked for the railroads. They were in charge of spying, and they, had contact with Black spies. It may well be that some of those Black spies held off information at times because in the early period of the war, it wasn't going to benefit us, Yeah, so you get this, the war's over, and you're maintaining slavery. Blacks ain't dumb, you know what I mean? So the first defeat that whites suffered was losing the Civil War and then losing the institution of slavery. But the second defeat, as I pointed out before, was the defeat of Southern political apartheid. That is, Southern Jim Crow or Southern segregation, including the denial to Blacks the right to vote, which we see now they're doing everything to go back to this period of denial. All these state legislatures coming up with ways to prevent Blacks from voting, brown people from voting, and also young people, but particularly Blacks. And unless Biden gets up off of his unwillingness to support the ending of the filibuster, and unless the Democratic holdout in the Senate, Manchin, doesn't get up off of his position, then we're going to find that it may well be in the next midterms, the Senate and House go back to the Republicans. And so it is very important that this legislation that does in a primary legislation at the state level to strip Blacks and other people of color of the right to vote, a sufficient number so that they can wheel their way back in, which then is preparing the White House for Trump in another 3 odd years from now. So this is something that seriously is at stake, but you're in the position to determine the outcome of that. You need to get up off your Black behinds and get involved in something. You watching my show, you should be doing something in your community. And if you are, let me know what it is. And if you aren't, get involved in whatever it is that's uplifting our people based on your interests, but not just putting your head into a book. A book's important, but then, you got to have a hook with the book. You know what I mean? Do something. So these two victories were real key. And the victory against Southern political apartheid was a major victory. But the biggest gain that we made during that time wasn't just ending segregation. It wasn't just restoring the right to vote. It wasn't just overturning the 1876 Hayes-Tilden Compromise. It wasn't just that. The biggest gain of the 60s was the freeing of Black minds. This was the biggest gain. And it was a gain that was possible because Blacks were fighting under new circumstances. When I did the thing on Black power in the Civil War, that was in the midst of Trump running for president, and I predicted how he would lose, predicted how Black Lives Matter had outflanked him and how he would go down, but mainly made the point. This is not 1876. That was the high tide of white power. This was the 60s. And in this case, this was 2020. This is the period of the decline of the West, the decline and fall of the United States, the rise of the East, China today, Africa tomorrow. This is a different period of time. It's a high water mark for us, whereas it was a low water mark for us before. But it's all in how you play the tide of history that determines its outcome. But this awakening was possible because of this high tide. The independence movements of Africa, the movements for independence in Asia, the Cuban Revolution, and the rise of Black people in this country and the Caribbean. This was what shaped the context for the freeing of Black minds in the 60s. And it was the greatest gain that our people made during this time. So this show has focused a lot on identifying your internal powers, the Ba within, the Ka within, the Ba, this ability to see ahead and behind, the Ka, your destiny, drawing on your internal powers. This show has focused on this to encourage you to realize the powers you have within yourself, because all change comes from within. And this is why we're going to be doing this webinar. You don't change society unless you change yourself. You can't really transform your community unless there's a personal transformation going on at the same time. For whites, when they talk about systemic change, it's always economics, political, social, but rarely personal, rarely spiritual, rarely getting inside a person and working your way out. And that's why these so-called revolutions in the West, like the Russian one, failed, because the ones that got in power were no different from the people they replaced. In fact, Stalin was a greater killer than any of the czars. And I don't know who killed more, Hitler or him, of his own people. You know what I mean? And he's supposed to be a revolutionary. What kind of revolution is that? Stone killer. You know what I mean? I told you the last show you saw that I did, it was on book signing at Greater Romani Church in Memphis, Tennessee, 1995. Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, was in the audience. And you should keep that leaflet because that's a historical little shot there. For me, it is. Me and him talking. And then at the end, I'm signing a book and giving him a copy. He was my good friend. I led the Black nationalist wing in C.O.R.E. He led the Black Power, Black nationalist wing within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the discussion I would have with him over and over, I've said this before, is the key to a revolutionary is transformation. It's awakening. And the key to all of that is the moral quality of the person. A great revolutionary has to be a great human being. And that's a discussion I always started with him on, because he was my buddy, but some revolutionaries like to focus on the ideology first. Now, it's the values of a person first. Person honest? Are they trustworthy? Are they kind? Are they good people? That's the key quality. And then those other things we can work on. So the greatest gain of the 60s was that as we freed up institutions in the process, we underwent transformation. We underwent change. King, in his theater in the South, he called it the New Negro. That is, people throwing off their inferiority complexes, people who had confidence in their ability to fight their oppressors. That's what he saw. Garvey called it the same thing. In the 20s, he talked about the New Negro. And then, of course, the Black freedom movement of the 60s, beginning in 63, we began to undergo a transformation of consciousness, not all of us, but a significant number. We drew on inner spirit powers, but particularly there was a shift of identity, and that shift of identity was key to changing everything else. From identifying with the system, from seeing ourselves in some ways that was white, to embracing our Blackness and our Africanness. This was a transformational process. So in fact, the first show that I did was on Free the Mind. And it was a show to introduce the audience to me, and particularly to stress how important the Black freedom movement was in my own awakening, and to stress how the Free the Mind thing impacted me. I didn't go into the details of how it worked, but how it transformed me. And you've heard me say that before. Malcolm X, Amilcar Cabral, Assata Shakur of the Black Panther Party, they all were able to make quality contributions to our people, deep contributions to our people, brilliant contributions to our people, because they underwent change and transformation. And when we did the show on the assassination of Malcolm X, that was Brother Baba Zak Kondo's point, that what he saw was the discipline of Malcolm. And that discipline came through transformation. And that enabled him to engage in 20 hours of organizing day and night and only 4 hours of sleep. He actually needed more sleep. But the fact is, once he underwent an awakening, he abandoned his negative ways and embraced a way of love, a way of consciousness, a way of brilliance. Amilcar Cabral, who I've said before is the greatest leader, thinker, organizer, military strategist in the 20th century, had been white. He underwent a transformation, whereas he said, we decided to be African. He underwent a transformational process, and what he was trying to do was to reproduce that within his party for the independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. He was assassinated before that was completed. And Africa needs that today. This transformational system that this webinar is going to be based on is certainly something that our leaders need, but our people need, because it takes them to their highest level of potential growth and development. But it particularly deepens their sense of knowing who they are, respecting it, and loving themselves. Assata Shakur, her critique of the Black Panther Party, and for those that don't know, she was one of the most important members of the Black Panther Party, is exiled in Cuba today. There's over $1 million reward on her. The Cubans keep her under lock and key, that is, they protect her. She was one of the brilliant organizers and leaders in the Black Panther Party and in the movements for change in the 60s. And she made the comment, and this is a critique of the Black Panther Party, they knew more about Mao Zedong and Marx than they knew about Nat Turner or Harriet Tubman, meaning party members were not educated in history and culture. And that weakened their ability to organize. And someone like Huey Newton, who was very brilliant, may not have died the way he did had this consciousness been deepened, because he was brilliant. His definition of power is the best definition I've ever seen. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He had streaks of brilliance, but had he undergone systematic transformation, we would have seen something much stronger. So this transformation of consciousness is real key. And the show on Free the Mind, the first show offered on the Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show, was to begin to touch on that. And then I did 2 shows called Preparations for African Identity. And this basically stressed the fact that we need this transformational system so we can overcome the ghost of slavery, including the ghost of inferiority, the ghost of seeing ourselves through somebody else's eyes, not seeing the beauty that is right before us, both external and internal. The ghost of self-doubt, the ghost of negativity. I mean, a clear sign that your mind's still on the plantation is when all you can see is the negative of something. Someone offers a beautiful idea and all they get from Black people is why it won't work, because they doubt that they themselves are capable of producing this. This is brainwashing. And the best way to overcome that is, 1, to undergo the transformation, but 2, to have confidence in yourself. But that comes from love. When you love yourself, you'll definitely have confidence in yourself. And a lot of us think self-love is arrogance. No, it's not. You hear me? No, it's not. Arrogance is like a balloon. It's hot air. It's false. It's false. It's an exaggerated idea of your abilities. That's arrogance, you know? It's looking down on others and not listening to what they have to say. That's arrogance. Love is a whole different thing. And humility and love go together, by the way. And God is the most humble of all. I've experienced a lot. I know some of you have in your communions with God. God is the most loving and the most humble. And love itself is a humbling experience. And people who are really in love with each other, the first thing they learn is to allow the other person just be themselves, get out of the way. Because relationships are not about changing people. Relationships are about growth, and people make their own decisions about change. And the sixfold stages to mental freedom, it's all up to you. But there's a process that you go through. And if you're open, then it's a process that will help you grow. It's kind of like putting water on grass. It's a watering process, you know? So we have covered this 3-part series also on the Twa and or the Anu at the stage of Kemet, the agrarian stage. And that was designed for us to look at roots, go back to the beginning. These are only introductory things, but in strengthening our own sense of self and developing a sense of strong African identity, going back to the source is crucial. And the source of African and world history are the Twa, and they have been left out. And Brother Kaba Hiawatha Kamene will be on next week, and we'll both be doing a discussion on comparing notes on the Twa, the Anu, in African and world history. So all of that has been to just lay a foundation for a deeper plunge into understanding of ourselves. On this show, we've also covered politics. And we particularly covered, and this is real key, because in any transformation, any healing that's going to occur in our community, we have to have a proper diagnosis of what's gone wrong. And if you note, when we had Professor Menu Ampin on, Menu was talking about the 2 kings, the king of 55 through 65, and then 65 through 68. And he was pointing out from 65 through 68, King had undergone revolutionary transformation. And at the very beginning of 65, he knew where he was going in that transformation. What King didn't know was that when he was assassinated in 1968 was the very date in which powerful forces would hit Black communities and put them in a position that God revealed to me was choosing between 2 cultures. This analysis of a choice between 2 cultures is the best contemporary analysis on the cause of disorder in Black communities and in the African world anywhere. And it's because it comes from God. It came through me, but because it comes from God. And I'm telling you, everyone that's used this, I've talked to people before, they all say it. Scholars say it, organizers say it, young people say it, old people say it, they all say the same thing. A choice between 2 cultures, yeah, because they're seeing cultural behavior now that we've never seen before. Levels of disrespect of elders, the disregard for life. These are things we never saw before. You hear me? So that when you pipe into God's whole mind, God gives you both the formulation of the problem and the answer, all in one. And so in the 6-fold stages to mental freedom, as we undergo this webinar thing, which I'll be talking about in a minute, knowing why our communities in the condition they're in is crucial to addressing the needs of that community. And I would say most of us don't fully understand that. We understand drugs hit our community. We understand Black families have been heavily hit. We understand that. We understand the marriage rate has dwindled. And some of us understand why. No finance, no romance. The jobs aren't paying enough to produce enough to support a family. But most of us do not appreciate the fact that these hostile forces that hit us have put us in a position of choosing to go deeper into our culture or to step outside of it. And that is key, to be precise, so that when we're talking about identity transformation, it's for what? Rebuilding families, rebuilding communities, rebuilding extended family communities. On the continent of Africa, rebuilding African nations, but along lines in which African people run them, as opposed to an elite answerable to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So this is really crucial. So King didn't know, time of his assassination, things would radically shift in Black communities. Malcolm didn't know either. His prophecies did not apply to that because he couldn't see that. These were forces so horrendous, he couldn't predict them. So a key reason I launched this show is to reach a broad group of viewers, especially including young viewers. And I'm really happy to see conscious viewers come in of whatever age. And I'm really happy when I get comments, and I'm going to refer to one in a minute, where they're referring to me as Baba or elder, and that's telling me their age. And I'm really glad for that, because other than that, I wouldn't be doing this. I'm putting my own money into this show. I'm putting a huge amount of time into it out of love, because I love my people and I'm giving you my best. I always do my best. I was a Boy Scout when I was brainwashed. I was a Life Scout, and I couldn't get an Eagle Scout because I couldn't swim until the last day of high school. You couldn't graduate because I was in the ROTC, a lieutenant colonel. I was a brainwashed, but military, second in command of all the ROTC units, got the award of the best cadet. I'm the best at whatever I do, I think. That's what I try and be. And so you couldn't graduate if you didn't take physical education. You had to be able to swim. What a dumb requirement. The last day of my class for swimming, I learned how to swim. Yeah, like hell if I'm staying another year in this school, you know what I mean? But I was in the Boy Scouts, you know what I mean? And be prepared and all this kind of stuff. That was designed to prepare you for war. But it was also good. You got to go camp, you got to go and ride horses, you got to go shoot guns, you know what I mean? You got to do all of this stuff, you know what I mean? So it was good. But they thought they were preparing me for Vietnam. They didn't know Vietnam was coming, but whatever war, America fights a war all the time. And so when I'm demonstrating on behalf of the Congress of Racial Equality in front of C.O.R.E Stadium, which was the old stadium across from my high school, Polytechnic High School, where they used to play football, my little Italian American, because I was living in a white community from 7 years of age until, so I'd been the, Life Scout and senior patrol leader and all this stuff. So here comes my scoutmaster. He's Italian Americans. This was an Italian church, Catholic church. And he comes up and looks at me. And I'm in the middle of demonstrating against racism in football. This was one of the first demonstrations we did at C.O.R.E. There's a guy named Sam Skinner that proposed this at Ella Hill Hutch's house. Ella Hill Hutch was the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. That Black woman got me in the movement, my mother's best friend, one of the kindest, most conscious, beautiful people I've ever known. And so here we are demonstrating, and my little muscular, little short Italian American, he comes in and looks at me and he says, "Bill, what happened to you?" For me, the answer was simple. I'm demonstrating against racism in sports. They need to have some Black football players here. I didn't get it. Later, I got it. What he meant was, we had you on a path. You're supposed to have a military uniform on, or you're supposed to be working in corporate America. What happened? What happened is I experienced the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. I underwent transformation, baby. That was just the beginning right there. I wasn't conscious of it then. I didn't know what it meant, what he said, but later I got the message. Uh-oh, he's saying something didn't work. Darn right it didn't. So I've taken that discipline that I got from the Boy Scouts, which I think I already had. It's internal. And then my family, we were taught to be excellent in whatever we did. My mother was a straight A student. She taught us everything we needed to know. When we went to school, we were probably third or fourth grade. All this stuff was boring. My mother had already taught us this. Come on, give me something challenging. That was my mother, you know what I mean? And then my father, he was the essence of the work ethic, worked 2 jobs, worked one, came in, took a bath, ate his dinner, went out, worked again, took another bath, went to sleep. Only day off was Sunday. That was my father, you know what I mean? And then would work upside the heads of white folks who use that N-word, knock them out and then say, that's me, buddy. That was my daddy. You understand? A walking war machine, one-man warrior, you know what I mean? And smart too, very smart. Never went to jail for none of that. That's why he became a bouncer, so he could be legally authorized to knock out white people who are threatening the business of a Chinese American named Charlie Lowe, a nice little multimillionaire Chinese American. So the key point I want to make is that we're going to strengthen Black families and Black communities. And this webinar, it's going to be about transformation, but the key point is to use it to help heal our communities, strengthen our communities. We got to have the proper diagnosis of what's gone wrong. And the choice between 2 cultures defines what position our people have been put in. And it therefore says, whatever we do, culture has to be a cornerstone along with the politics, the economics, family rebuilding, and a host of other things. So this is the key reason that I launched this show, is so that we could prepare people so that we could get into this kind of thing. And so it's the sharing of this that is most important. Now, the best way to deal with healing, particularly the healing that has to deal with the ghost of slavery and the post-1968 external forces, and drugs being the worst of it, but many others that have put us in this position. The best way to deal with the healing is to put the first stress on identity transformation. This is real key, because when you deal with identity transformation, then you're clearing up the confusion, the muddle that comes out of slavery. And then the muddle that's been accentuated now by the external forces that have led some of us to put material and individual things before our own humanity. So identity transformation is crucial. But getting into addressing the webinar, I wanted to start with a comment made by one of our viewers. And I always look at these comments, and there's some very interesting ones. You all have a lot to say. And they're usually the comments that come sometimes in the chat, but a lot of times underneath the particular show, people will hone in and make comments. And this one I found to be particularly insightful. It comes from Brother Robert. He didn't give his whole name, so Robert is his name, I'm saying Brother Robert. He makes a comment, and the comment, I think, is a challenge, and it's a challenge that speaks to what a transformational system needs to address. And he's raising it, and you can see this is a younger brother in this case. I get the sisters who are raising some real good points as well. And he's addressing it to his elder. But this is also an address to elders, because he's raising a point of what he sees as a weakness that is coming from African-centered scholarship, where there's some good information, but there's something missing. And this is, so I wanted to read this to lay the foundation for getting in more into this webinar. He said, and I'm quoting him, we have heard scholars and historians speak on Kemetic history and spiritual aspects of this period. And here he's talking about ancient African history, I think. this comment was made on one of the Anu series. Let me repeat it again. We have heard scholars and historians speak on Kemetic history and spiritual aspects of this period, but they have been unable to show the community the spiritual step-by-step process for healing and recovery. This is real important he's making here. While there's been some good information that he's getting from our scholars and stuff, he said that what has generally happened is that we have been unable, the scholars have, to show the community the spiritual step-by-step process for healing and recovery. Real important point he's making. And then he goes on, quoting him again. The question is, do we have a process for healing to uplift the community and to redirect the current situation to renewal? So this is a real key point. He's talking about community healing, not just for himself, but for his community. He went on to talk about the high spiritual civilization worked out in Kemet to make another point. He goes on to say, referring to discussions that I had in previous Anu shows, and I've called them spirit science. And then he goes on to say, what you call spiritual science, but with all of our knowledge of the period, ancient African history, we can't show the community how to live spiritually to heal the community from trauma of our horrible experience of the current mental, physical, and spiritual bondage that shackles us today. He goes on to suggest that what our scholars need to do with the ancient Kemetic texts to benefit our people. And so he's saying, he made some comments on what he thought needed to happen in terms of, translating the scholarly texts and stuff to apply it today, since he thinks that the answer comes out of these texts and applying them to healing and stuff. So then he goes on to make the point. If we can't transmit an experience for our collective benefit, then it's just more knowledge without work, thus no spiritual advancement or progress. And then he goes on, and then in conclusion, he said, with respect to the elder, meaning this is his comment. I have a comment here by one of our viewers on the chat. He said, many elders, as you have pointed out before, are suffering from an arrested development. Many who are physically in their 40s and 50s are mentally in their 20s. Can the sixfold stages mend this? Oh, yeah. So he's raising a very important question. And I look at these comments, and there have been a number of valued comments. Some of them I've seen the need to act on. I haven't been able to yet, but I plan to. So that's part of the reason why I do these chats, but I also like to see these comments. But in this particular case, he's really making the case. He's making the case that he's first asking the question, do we actually have systems that will help us in the healing process coming out of our history? In this case, he's locating it to Kemet. So this is the overall question, and I agree with him. I think that some of this is lacking in terms of presentation, and there are reasons, but I also have other comments, but I agree with his fundamental point. He's making a good point, and this is precisely what these webinars are designed to address and what this show has been preparing people for. And I know from the comments other people have been making, a lot of you are going through transformation now. Some of you have gone through a lot before. Some of you are extremely well read. I know that. There's a core within the core. I got a dedicated group of people who watch this show. It needs to expand. You need to be recruiting people. People need, when they watch this show, to subscribe. It's simple. Just hit the button. That means all kinds of difference in terms of what we can do. The more people we can reach, the better. That's the key point. But the quality of people we have that have been watching this show is truly outstanding. So, Brother Robert is raising the fundamental question, and I agree with him that our communities need methods and systems that arise out of our history and culture for healing. However, I do not think that those scholars who put forward good information and wisdom without systems are a waste of time, because we can use the information they're providing to help us construct systems. Everybody doesn't create systems. And by the way, for you to be able to create systems, you have had to undergo transformation. This is real key. And then be able to share it. So, but I agree with his point. Information alone is not going to get us transformation. So Brother Roberts is correctly asking his elders, including me, do we have systems for healing our people that arise out of our culture as African people? Now he's seeing it the way he's phrased it as coming out of Africa. His central focus, because what we were covering is Kemet, but I would suggest that these systems come out of Africa. But I would not just Kemet, and I would also suggest they come out of African American history and culture and our experience. And that's where we underestimate ourselves. And we have, in fact, as we get into these systems, we'll see that we've developed some here, and some are carryovers that we carried from Africa, but then we've invested it with some new elements, some of which I won't even have time to get into today. So I basically think that he's making a good point. That what we have to offer has to help us in terms of healing and growth and development as a people. And of course, basic to this is we can have systems, but do they work? And this is a key point I really want to make, is you have to test systems. The only way you test them is to live them. And again, the Western system is just about information. It's not about transformation, because their system is about servicing their society. And they're not interested in transformation. That transformation may take you out of service. It may lead you to be dedicated against the system. They're not interested in that. But the key point is that not only should be, the system should be transformational, but it should be tested. And through test, we should be able to see that it works. There should be products that prove it. I hate to use the word products, but people who live this. If it's economic or political or social systems that work. And this is real key in terms of systems. And as I've just suggested, these systems aren't only systems that arise out of our ancient historical and cultural past. These systems come out of African and African American history and culture as well. And as we get into the transformational system that's going to guide our webinar, you'll see how we contribute to that here, what we've contributed. So my overall answer to Brother Robert is, do we have systems arising out of African civilization that can be adapted to today's circumstance to healing our people? The answer is yes. And do we have them coming out of the African American experience? Yes. Now, what I want to stress is, and this is particularly why this reality here has to generate and has generated some answers for awakening, for consciousness and healing of our own that's good for the world, and it's generated in Africa and in the Caribbean and other places, is that some of the most important healing systems, and the one that is going to be the basis for this intensive year-long webinar on the 6-fold stages to mental freedom, that's an organic system. It's organic. As I pointed out, I'm an organic scholar. I threw away a lot of, particularly the misinformation of the Western system when I underwent this awakening that the sixfold stages to mental freedom is a part of and triggered. So that was a part of it. But as a part of that awakening process that came through the sixfold stages to mental freedom, there was the experience of transformation that was key, and that arose out of the particular situation. So when I say it's organic and I threw away the information, I also began to throw away the method, because the method was a regurgitation method. Western education is essentially a system of where you put information before people and they repeat it. That's essentially what it is. They'll call it critical thinking. What they want you to do is critically think about what they've already given you and not be too critical about it. Because if you get too critical, you might get an F. I should know, I've been in this system a long time, and most of you should know. Paulo Freire, who wrote the book, Pedagogy of Liberation, Pedagogy of Freedom, he makes the point that the Western system's a banking system where they bank information inside of you and you feed it back. That's the Western system. So the system that the sixfold stages to mental freedom is based on is organic. It comes out of the grassroots. It comes out of the situation that we faced in the course of struggle. And as our eyes opened up, it took us on a path. And that path was a transformational path. So it was organic. Now, implied in Brother Robert's question is that while knowledge presented through historical facts is important, if we're going to shape systems from our history and culture that heal, these systems must enable us to undergo transformation. This is a key. This is implied in what he's saying. In ancient Kemet, the symbol for transformation was the Egyptian scarab, the beetle. This is an example of it. If you could see my study, I have a huge wing of Horus scarab beetle on my wall because it's my netter. It's my divine principle. This ring you see that I wear, that's a beetle. My name, T'Shaka, means beetle because it describes my essence. But the key point is in Kemetic transformational systems, the scarab or the beetle represents the netter of transformation. Netter can be divine principle, or netter could be an ancestor who's passed on, a C.O.R.E, the netter of life, death, and rebirth, Heru or Horus, the netter that symbolized pharaohship, and so forth. But it's a divine principle or divine force. Could be a divine ancestor, divine spirit. So in Kemet, transformation is explained through Khepra. Khepra, or the beetle, is symbolic of transformation. So there are many different forms of Khepra. Khepra is spelled K-H-E-P-E-R. This is one form. K-H-E-P-E-R, and then /D-J-E-S, and then of. Khepra, just of. Now, so there are many ways in which transformation is manifested and expressed in Kemetic culture and in life, but this is their symbolic way of portraying it. So as Khepra, just of, this means to be or exist as Khepra, K-H-E-P-E-R, or Kepra just means to come into existence by himself. And we'll come back to what that means. Khepru, K-H-E-P-E-R-U, K-H-E-P-E-R-U means modes of existence. So here the Kemites are describing the transformation of states of existence. And then Khepri, K-H-E-P-E-R-I, meaning being or what is. So for being, in the Kemetic sense, it's a transformational thing. Another concept of change or transformation is Khepra, K-H-E-P-R-E-R, Khepra. It means the becoming one. Now, in fact, that's what you are. We're all becoming ones. We're in the process of becoming something. We're undergoing change. It could be of age, of life. The Kemites had a saying, life is slow dying. Death's a rebirth to a new life. It's constant change, you know? It can be the transformation of consciousness, the one we're dealing with here. In this particular case, identity consciousness, identification of who you are. And it can also mean Khepra, the ever becoming one. Again, describing the nature of what it is to be human or to exist. It's to undergo change. Khepru, K-H-E-P-E-R-U, K-H-E-P-E-R-U describes Mother Nature, the cosmos, history, culture, humanity, as it undergoes change or transformation. And going back to the highest level that I started with, Khepra Dejeso, K-H-E-P-E-R-D-E-J-E-S-O-F, K-H-E-P-E-R-D-E-J-E-S-O-F. It means he who came to existence by himself. This is referring to Ptah, P-T-A-H, God who emerges from the primeval waters. And as God emerges from the primeval waters, which in Kemet is the first occasion, because they see the first occasion as a watery like mass, full of electromagnetic energy, which is a concept of physics in their idea of origin. So what comes out of that is God coming out of that in the form of Khepra in the transformational digest of. So the one who comes into existence by himself. This can also be symbolic of those of us who ascend to a level of creativity that we renew ourselves so much that we bring something new into the world. So George Washington Carver would be representative of this. But always those who bring in this new have discovered the old. And almost always it's with the help of God. God usually gives us the answer to that. And Black people ain't the only ones that do this. This is the highest level of human growth and development. And so in Einstein, theory of relativity, he didn't invent it, he discovered what was already there. And the formula is simple, but before it was discovered, it wasn't. It's a great breakthrough. And because God's revelation provided the basis for it, there ain't no holes in it. You hear me? It's without error. And that's rare in life. So transformation is about change. It's about change of the society that you're in, the change of the state of nature that we're in, which we're seeing now through global warming. If we don't address this through changing how we see the world and our relationship to it, and altering the sciences and altering all the things that contribute to global warming, then there will not be a place for our children to live. This place will become uninhabitable. So systems that are healing perform a P.A.P.O function. They're transformative. And that's the nature of life itself, the undergoing of transformation. And oftentimes crisis is the basis for transformation. The golden age of the 60s was a period of great crisis. And crisis usually has two qualities. One, it's a period of disorder, confusion, whatever. And it's a period of opportunity. The greatest growth usually occurs in periods of crisis. So the 60s produced all of this beautiful change and transformation, not only in the consciousness of people, but in the art form, in all forms of the culture, in all areas of Black life and in life in general, but particularly Black life and African life, because of the nature of the crisis, just as the Civil War produced its transformation, especially for Blacks, because of the crisis. So the question is, what do you do with the crisis? And so the crisis of identity, my transformation that was a part of what became, we now know as the sixfold stages to mental freedom, came out of crisis, not knowing something and uncovering truth and then following. The rule in life, follow the truth. Don't follow people, follow the truth. I always tell people that. Don't follow me, follow the truth. And always question everything and see if it's real, see if it works, see if it's good, see if it advances life, Don't just take it off of faith, That's for God. Everything else deserves critical scrutiny. And the reason why you won't be critical of God is so right that all you can say is, oh. It's like when your mama tells you something about yourself, all you can say 9 or 10 times is, oh. She oftentimes knows you better than you know yourself. I know that was the case with my mother. So systems have to have this P.A.P.O transformation power to it. And then it can work transformation or change. Now, this webinar that I'm proposing is going to operate off of something that I've created especially for this occasion. I've been using it for some other things as well. It's going to come under a special unit that I've created called the P.A.P.O House of Life, which was the highest university system in ancient Kemet. Amilcar Cabral Elevator Leadership Institute. In other words, when you go into this training, you're going to get a package that describes the curriculum that a lot of this comes out of it. You're only going to be dealing with a few pieces of it for this. And what I'm showing you here is a portrayal of P.A.P.O. And what you see in the center is the square. And that square, it's hard to see, but there's a figure standing there. And that figure standing there is a S.A.R.E. And a S.A.R.E. is standing on 9 bows. Bows is in bows and arrows, B-O-W-S. The brother with the sunglasses is Amilcar Cabral, and the sister on the other side is Ella Baker. And so this is called the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Organizer Institute. All it means by leadership is whatever area of life you're trying to develop your skills in, you can call that leadership. You're developing them, and this is part of what this House of Life system is about. And then there are figures that are hard to see, but you'll see N and S, north and south, and then on the bottom, east and west. And so on one, you see a bird, and that bird is Tehute. And then on the other side, you see the hawk, and that's Horus on the top. And then on the bottom, on east, you see Nephthys, and on the west, Isis or Aset. And then on the top, you see a figure whose arms are outstretched and who is moving from east to west with arms outstretched. Now, this leadership transformational training is an adaptation of the highest educational system in ancient Kemet, P.A.P.O, which meant house of life, which the Ankh is symbolic of, was the highest educational system in the world, an outgrowth of the secret societies of Inter-Africa. There were transformational systems. It's an adaptation of this ancient African system to today's realities. That's why it's called the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Institute. So we're adapting certain methods that come out of ancient Kemet, certain philosophies and principles to today's reality. And we're taking Ella Baker, one of the two best leaders of the 60s, Malcolm being the other, and Amilcar Cabral, the absolute best leader, thinker, strategist, military organizer in the 20th century, in my opinion of many, who also underwent the sixfold stages to mental freedom. So what do these symbols mean? S.O.R.E, the fact that he's the center, it's hard to see this figure, but he's the center of P.A.P.O. What that means is this is a place of transformation because S.O.R.E is symbolic of life, death, and rebirth. I'm not going to go into the whole story of S.O.R.E, but that's generally what he represents. He's standing on 9 bows, B-O-W-S, bows. The bow and arrow was one of the favored weapons for military units or any self-defense organizations during that period of history. And so 9 bows symbolizes the enemies of Kemet. The fact that their founding ancestor, who was Anu, and you've seen a picture of him in a previous show, is standing on the 9 bows, and he is the center of the highest educational system in the world, their educational system. He is the first or founding ancestor, and he represents the transformative process. The fact that he's standing on 9 bows means that Kemet education, Kemetic education, was to prepare you to defend your society against any outsiders, against those who would oppress you. It wasn't just to prepare you for an occupation. It was to prepare you so that you couldn't be taken out. And if you were put in a bad position, you could get back. And so this was at the heart of what P.A.P.O was about. The fact that you have the netters on the top, the netter tehute, or the Greeks called them Thoth, that's the netter of creativity. They created most of the sciences and social sciences in pre-dynastic Kemet. Now, whether he did or not is not the point. The point is these were created in ancient pre-dynastic Kemet, and he is treated as the netter of that. And the fact that Horus is up on the top, he is the netter for the pharaoh, symbolic, the son of S.O.R.E, symbolic of pharaonic rule. And then the fact that you have Nephthys in the east, that is the wife of Set, who in dynastic Kemet is the one that tore S.O.R.E apart. He's put back together and reborn on the spiritual plane. In pre-dynastic Kemet, I conclude that that couldn't have happened because Set was the netter of the pharaoh, and there's no way The first pharaoh being Asar, there is no way that a brother who tore him up would be the symbol for pharaohs. I think that's a story we get out of dynastic Kemet. Starting with Ahamena. And that's natural. When you take over, then whatever is your royal symbol, that's what justifies your rule. So you got to kind of put down to an extent, even the founders. And then on the other side is Aset, the wife of Asar, the source of power in Kemet, the founder of agriculture, symbolic of corn and everything else, and who rules in his absence, but is the source of rulership while he rules. And then this figure who's going from east to west. East is the realm of life. It's the realm of the rising sun. It's the realm of Kepra as a new sun. I'm born at 5 in the morning. One reason why I picked the name Shaka, which means beetle, is because it's the rising sun. It's symbolic of creativity. But moving to the west, that's the setting sun. Symbolically, this figure who has arms outstretched, he's moving from life to death to a rebirth to a new life. So again, this transformational system that will be centered at this point on the sixfold stages. There are other transformational systems we'll go into at other times. This is key for how we're adapting this, because let's be key. Kemites did not need a sixfold stages to mental freedom. They didn't have slavery. They didn't have colonialism. So we just can't go back to Africa and take everything. We got to also go back to Black, and we got to draw from some stuff here that also, while we're drawing from Africa. So it's a double take. We're drawing from the best of this Kemetic higher secret society system for transformation. And at the same time, we're recreating organically, coming out of our organic response, transformational systems that will do healing to stuff the Kemites never dreamed of, at least until they got conquered. And even then, they didn't have to deal with it the way we have to deal with this right now. So this is an adaptation, and we're drawing from old systems because a lot of the transformation is digging down deep into your past, African American, but it's also coming up with systems for transformation designed to heal what we're going through here. And these also reflect organic responses to our situation here. Now, one of the things that I've made a point of before in preparation for dealing with this, I stressed you need to really look at your African-American culture, what I call New African culture, because it has African and African-American components. And then, of course, it has a lot of negative stuff that we have to get rid of. One reason why we have to draw from this culture is it's what we recreated here to sustain us. And most of us have neglected it, not studied it. Our musicians, even the great ones like Dizzy Gillespie, refused to play the blues because it was associated with slavery. A lot of Blacks coming out of slavery, particularly the Sadidi ones, the elite ones, they did not want to hear any spirituals because it reminded them of slavery. And so they started singing classical music that would put you to sleep. Even white people find some of that stuff boring. Don't get me wrong, it's their music, it's good. And I think the Italians, they got a real, and the Spanish, they got some soul in their stuff, you know, Pavarotti and stuff. You see some of these, they're beautiful. I've seen some of the stuff that some of the people on Facebook have shared with me, where you bring in a James Brown singing with one of these Italian opera singers. They're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And he, of course, knew it was beautiful. One coming from the funky realm and the other one from the high-pitched realm. But those Italians had Hannibal. They got an injection of something else. Those Spanish, they had the Moors. They got something else in there. You understand? It fired their system up, So there's some little beauty coming out of that. I'm not knocking it. I'm just simply saying that we often turned our back on what was most beautiful because we're associating it with slavery. We didn't enslave us for the most part. This was a European system. And so we created a culture out of this. We created an art form out of this magnificent beauty. And so after a while, Dizzy said, well, he made a mistake, in turning his back on the blues because he started listening to Charlie Parker. And what was Charlie Parker? Buttermilk blues, soul blues, Charlie Parker. Or later, as he developed John Coltrane, holiness stuff, using that minor blues note, which is that spooky note of the Black church. That's what you heard in Coltrane. And when he ascended to the highest level of Love Supreme, oh my, there's a number of musicians and a number of people have said when they hear that music, it brings them to their knees, because it's in praise of God. It's not pushing any religion. It's simply in praise of God. So I stressed before that when we look at the ethos of every people have a way they carry themselves, ethos, the way you walk, the way you talk. It's your whole carriage, it's your whole everything about you. Every people have a special ethos. The Chinese, it's Qi, it's order. 1,400,000,000 people, order, but it's a just order if it's going to stay, The European, you think it's what you call white supremacy. Yeah, well, no. The heart of it is their culture. If you go to the heart of their culture, it's arbitrariness. Whoever has power does whatever they want. And that's how they basically conquered the world. And then, of course, white supremacy, as you call it, I don't. White racism, tied to it, creates genocide, slaughter, dehumanization, a whole bunch of things. But it's arbitrariness. That's their thing. And look at how Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. That was arbitrary, based on circumstance. It wasn't guided by any principles, other than survival, maintaining the Union, or at least the conditions for maintaining it through victory of the Northern armies. So their ethos is not guided by ethics per se, even though they'll talk that talk. And I've made the point before that the African in the United States, we have an ethos. The ethos in Kemet was Ma'at, clearly. They have this high civilization, Ma'at drives it. And so it's a noble civilization that is driven by noble ideas, high ideals, and Kemet was driven by that. Truth, justice, harmony, right order. It doesn't mean all pharaohs followed it. They did not. Some did not. But it meant that was the goal. And the society was organized around that. And they believed there were consequences if you departed from right doing. So their mantra for Ma'at was speak truth, do truth. And by the way, that pretty well gets into the system of transformation. So Kemet was driven by this. Our ethos comes out of our circumstance. Unlike the Caribbean, we weren't the majority in the United States. We were the majority in certain states. And we were facing a successful settler colonial system that was in the process of wiping out 90% of the Native Americans. So we were in a tough, rough position here. Slavery was tough on everybody, but given the circumstances, we weren't like the Caribbean, where African culture would just take its root alongside of the European stuff coming from whites. So in the Caribbean, as one of the great historians, Eric Williams, said, the author of Capitalism and Slavery, said Africa was dropped in the Caribbean. You know, you're 90%, 98% in most islands, you know, that's what it was. Here we had to recreate, drawing on from fundamental African principles, recreating a new African culture, spirit and family-based, highly ethical. And so my point about this African American, who I spent as much time studying as anything in Africa, in fact, a little bit more, because this is my people right here. You hear me? And what do you find when you look at us? And it's an ethos we take for granted very often. Our ethos is creativity. The African in America to survive had to be Brer Rabbit-like, had to be the hook and the crook, had to make something out of literally almost nothing, though this creativity was made off of Africa, best of African principles, along with what we added, two of which was race consciousness, and the other of which is Pan-Africanism, this idea of one Africa. These two both come out of this new African culture. So this is the nature of our people. And as we're talking about dealing with healing and everything else in our Black community, we have the creative reservoir for handling that. And I think what we need to recognize is that everything we do to heal our people will not come out of the sixfold stages to mental freedom. It will not come out of other systems that are African-based or that we have, you know, transformed here. Some of them come out of just basic stuff that we have developed specialists in. We have people now who have serious problems of drug addiction, serious problems of alcoholism, which traces all the way back to slavery, because a lot of this alcoholism has to do with a lot of pain that people are suffering, and alcohol is one way to escape the pain. And so we have people trained in how to deal with this. And there are mental health issues that we have to deal with as well that come out of our culture. And in fact, African culture is quite good at healing what's called mental disorders. They actually heal it, where our Western systems are good at talking to you about it, medicating you, and stabilizing you so you act normal, but not good at the actual healing. So there, you're going to need the use of African methods. And we have some of those, and we have to draw from them also in our communities, and draw from it from the African base as well. And a lot of our older people have these methods as well, and we need to learn from them. But our creativity is a key resource in any kind of transformation that we do. Now, a big obstacle in the way of creating systems for transformation and change is the Western educational method of educating. I've been cautioned. One of the people who will help me with this show when we do the part on the webinar was talking about he didn't like the word pedagogy. I shouldn't use it. Pedagogy means system of instruction. You use the word physics, you use the word chemistry, you know what I mean? They all require explanation, but I get the point. But the point is the method of instruction, which is called pedagogy, which in Kemet was called SEBA, S-B-A, or S-E-B-A, that had a special meaning, and I'll go into that in a minute. The Western system for instruction is a big obstacle in the way of us creating healing systems if they come from any of us who have been Western educated, and most of us have. We think that because we have now corrected a lot of the misinformation, we're home free. We've corrected what Carter G. Woodson identified as the problem of taught someone else's history, philosophy, culture, so forth. We then do the bidding of the master without being told to do so. I call this, as you saw in the last show, the remote control automatic pilot 00 soul Negro. who's on remote control and doesn't know it, thinking somebody else's thought and doesn't know it, because his mind or hers has been stuffed full of someone else's information, and we pass this off as thinking. So in creating healing systems, we got to understand we have to have solved the problem of the teaching trap. And I'm going to tell you, most of us haven't. Most of us haven't. Because the more highly educated you are, the better you were at excelling in the system, the harder it is for you to even see a way out, And you literally have to undergo a life, death, rebirth, transformation of consciousness to even begin for that to happen. Had I not gone through this, I wouldn't have found a way. And the book I'm working on now, Seba, it's more than that. To know the truth is to be the truth. That breaks this trap. It breaks this trap. I shared it with Dr. Obinga a couple of weeks ago, who has said, we have a problem. African-centered knowledge and Eurocentric methodology, he should know he came under the French system. Takes 10 years to get a PhD in the French system. They have really got you when they finish with that. Fortunately, he got saved. He apprenticed under Sheikh Anta. So we have to be able to break the teaching trap. And implicit in the sixfold stages to mental freedom is breaking the teaching trap. Those of you who have got like my paper, it's a 40-page paper that goes along with the Integration Trap book. Some have gone to Philippe Matthews, the 6 days of 2 hours each on the sixfold stages. You think you've got it. You don't need it. Oh, yeah? Did you get transformation through that? What you got was information. It's a process you have to go through for the transformation. And this transformation breaks the teaching trap, which is solely an information trap. They just give you information. And now it's coming from the African perspective. So you think it's good, but you use it the same way you do with white information. It's just Black or African. You're doing it the same way. And so Robert's point earlier, it can't promote healing. It doesn't. Because you have to experience this Kepler transformation thing. And so it's built into the way this system works. And that's why it's going to be a 12-month webinar, because transformation is time. And then it's ongoing. It's life. It's a life experience. So this teaching trap isn't just a teaching trap for Blacks. This is the teaching trap for people of color, because people of color are caught in this same teaching trap. So if we get good information, not only on African history, but let's say Latino history or some component of Asian, Chinese, Filipino, whatever, Japanese, whatever, Native American got a better chance because that reservation system, they've been producing the people on reservations, AIM, American Indian Movement, many others, returning to their traditions, relearning their languages and stuff. And so there's a rebirth among Native Americans of their way, what they call the red way, So the webinar that we're going to be doing on the sixfold stages to mental freedom, we're employing a different method. You'll only know this method when you experience it. It doesn't come just through talk. Talk's a part of it, but it is not the main thing. Carter G. Woodson identified the need for us to break with the misinformation, but he could not at that time deal with the need to break from the system of teaching because we didn't know enough about how these systems should work in the African or New African way. We didn't know. So it's not a critique of him. This is our task and this is our challenge. And I'm telling you, my book on Seba, it's broken it, baby. And it's broken it on a bunch of different levels. And it works. And so part of it is built into how the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which is mental, spiritual, and physical freedom work. So it breaks out of teaching solely to the mind and embraces the whole person. As long as we're caught in the white informational teaching trap, where teaching is just information and all we do is regurgitate it, then we're into what Brother Ronald criticized as too much solely giving information, but not being able to produce transformation. This then leads to a particular state that's funny, but real, and it's not really funny. It leads to the Oreo cookie mentality of dark on the outside, white on the inside. That's for us. It leads to the banana mentality, Asian, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. Or the apple, red, Native American, red on the outside, white on the inside. Or the coconut, brown, Latino, brown on the outside or whatever the shades are, and white on the inside. So you will find yourself in a trap where you might be saying one thing and doing another, because thought and being are separate in the Western system. And I'm telling you, up to now, we haven't figured out how to bring those two together. And you can't do any healing unless you're able to do that, because healing's total, mind, body, and spirit. So Brother Robert wants to know, do we have these healing systems? Yes. And I pointed out the choice between two cultures provides the framework for us being able to address these in our current conditions as a people. The key thing is the sixfold stages to mental freedom are a case where part of it is drawing from the depths of ancient African and African-American history and culture, part of it. But the methodology itself, the system, it is an organic system that grows out of our response to brainwashing in this country. This same response has been developed. Cabral experienced it in Africa, and I'm sure there are others who have experienced it in the Caribbean as well, because the brainwashing experience is global. But it required us to go inside ourselves to recreate ourselves, drawing on our past. So it's not that we're neglecting the African-American past. That's part of it. But the substance, the system itself came from an organic response. By that, I mean, your awakening is like an organism, and it's got an order to it. It's got a system to it. And the system of awakening that I experienced, that Malcolm experienced, Malcolm, on the eve of his death, if you had asked him to describe it, he couldn't, because he was too close to it. And it had not been described before. And I couldn't. It took a while before I could stand back and get a perspective on it. And in fact, the system for the sixfold stages to mental freedoms, an innovation made by myself and being able to clock it, and Bulanlela Wabogo, a brother I mentioned before, who's a chemist, a musician, a martial artist, and a historian. He looked at Wretched of the Earth and saw some things, and he saw a lot more than Frantz Fanon saw. And then he constructed some ideas, and I looked at the transformation I was undergoing. And then I looked at the transformation that others underwent. And then I took a lot of people through it, 50 years of taking people through this system. The people who will help me on the webinar are people who have been through this system for about 40, 45 years. There will be 3 people a sister named Fania McKinney, who has been on some of these chats, very conscious sister, one of my good friends. I married her and her husband, and her oldest daughter's first name came from my first wife. So we're close. She's a very conscious sister. She'll be assisting me in taking people through this transformational process. She works in a mentoring program full time. And so this is one way she's applied to it. She's in an African-centered church. Thabiti Mtambuzi will be helping you. He's a former student of mine. He's in his 70s. He's a little millionaire. You'd never know it. He wears dreads, African clothes. He's in Zanzibar right now. He spends as much time in Africa as he does here. Real smart. He used the six-fold stages in the juvenile justice system that he worked in for over 20 years. And then he's used it in other ways. And then another brother that will be working with me on this is a brother named Ustadi Kadiri. Ustadi is close to Thabiti. They're friends, and he's a friend of mine. Ustadi is also a former student of mine. He's in his 70s. He's around 75 or so. And he went through this same transformational system. Ustadi is a community organizer. He is also a mathematician. He is also a master printer, and he's also a master mechanic. And he is one beautiful human being. When older people in our community are undergoing illness, Ustadi's the one there, bringing them food. He's the one that's taking them to the hospital. He's the one looking after them. It's a really loving and kind person. So these are people who have different levels of experience in the six-fold stages to mental freedom in their own life and in helping other people go through it. So they'll take people through an experience. And this experience you don't get in any university. So that's the adaptation of P.A.P.O to this situation here. So part of then the six-fold stages to mental freedom is it comes out of the period of the 60s where Africa is rising, Asia is rising, Blacks in this country are rising. And as a result, we're in a strategic position to affect change. As we come up with Black power, Native Americans are calling for red power, and other people of color are calling for power for their own communities. As we produce change, it creates a chain reaction in this country. As I pointed out, the San Francisco freedom movement inspired the free speech movement of white students to radicalize white universities. And as we developed Black studies, then it led to Asian American, Latino, Native American, and women's studies. So the transformation of consciousness came out of a period of change and a period of transformation. The transformation around America's war policies. Blacks in this country were the first to oppose the war in Vietnam and inspired a lot of other Black people to stand up against it. But all of this came from a transformation of consciousness. That transformation of consciousness, when we talked about King, Menu Ampin was charting his consciousness. Mine came through going up against an economic system and then seeing that though we were victorious and produced thousands of jobs for Blacks and people of color, America's not structured to provide freedom, not on economics, political, or any other level. There's going to have to be transformation of the society. But the point is, it was the power of our people in motion tied to world power and world change that was leading to a decline of the West. But it was the awakening that occurred in the minds of many of us that led to a new consciousness that was aggressive rather than servile, forceful rather than submitting, creative rather than imitative, and boldly creative in a whole bunch of ways, not just in the arts, but the arts especially the Black arts movement, a profound statement financed by Blacks. So the greatest gain we made in the 60s was the freedom of the mind. Without that gain, no El Hajj Malik El Shabazz and none of the other great freedom fighters that we produced. I pointed out in the integration trap, a lot of our movements would have been stronger had they had this transformational process inside of them. A Huey Newton would have been stronger had he been able to go through these stages. He might not have died the way he did, as I pointed out earlier. So this transformational system is organic. We went through it without knowing the stages. We were following the truth. So when Malcolm is undergoing his transformation in prison, and there's a magnificent book out now on him, Rising from the Dead. It's just received the Pulitzer Prize. I think it's Les Payne, who's the author, National Book Award. It deserves it because it's done groundbreaking work on Malcolm that has not been done before. He interviewed a lot of people that were in Malcolm's life that are now dead, that had not been interviewed in this way, and it brought out a lot of information. But the key thing is that Malcolm's transformation was again a part of this organic process. The messenger had his method, which was religious, and it was good, and Malcolm used it, it helped him. But Malcolm's method came from this organic process, and that organic process was total. It was spiritual, mental, physical. It was political, it was social, it was economic, it was historical, it was cultural. The only area he was weak in was literature. He didn't study literature, partially because the books in the prison library didn't have it, but he didn't request them because his family brought him all the Black books. So the point is, when we underwent this transformation, my transformation process, same as his, but I didn't know his. I didn't know that he had went through one because mine was 63. His book came out that marked his in 66, 65, 66. So we weren't following anybody. And this idea that Malcolm woke the movement up, most of us were awakened by the conditions we faced. And those of us who faced it, faced our ignorance, faced what we didn't know about ourselves, and began to undergo a transformation of ourselves, then we underwent this change, Everything must change, nothing remains the same. The young become the old. We were undergoing that Kepra change. We didn't know where it was leading. But as we pursued it, then we could uncover those paths of transformation. And that was truly a healing and an awakening process. It healed me from having my mind on remote control. That was the main thing it did for me. It got me to be free to think for myself. This was a key thing, deeply, and to see beyond my situation. My health is in part tied to that. I don't undergo stress. That's me anyway. I ain't got no fear or nothing. I cause stress. I don't undergo stress. I mean, I got a plan for everything, baby, even the spur of the moment plan. I got a plan, you know what I mean? So, but this transformation of consciousness is like the key thing, and it comes out of this organic response that has produced the sixfold stages to mental freedom that we have been able to track. But not, so those of you who have read the papers, you got the stages. I'm not going into them today, but that's not the experience. And you may be going through something, but it's like anything. I lift weights. If you go into the gym and lift the weights wrong, you're getting no results. And it's the same thing with transformation. There's a path to it. There are some steps that you take to really get this inside of you so that you be the truths that you're learning. And so you can't skip stuff. You can't play with this or it'll come out imbalanced. And so this is really the basis for this. So this organic system, which leads to the eye-opening experience mine of when I began to think for myself to myself, oh shit, that was the awakening. Because it's the realization that you have assumed that certain things were the way they were and they are not. And for each generation, your awakening is going to come under different circumstances. Mine came on the basis of knowing how the system works. You might know some of that, but yours is going to come on other levels. It's whatever levels you haven't got together. And that's where the awakening hits you. Everybody, it comes on their level. And that's also the key thing about this transformational system. And so this is your first experience of real freedom. Freedom of the mind and the spirit, and that will lead you to a freedom of the body. And I'm going to tell you, some enslaved Africans had this, by the way. Not all Africans dropped dead at 50. You had some, like my great aunt that maintained the history of our family, living past 100, 120, 126, 127. That means there was some African stuff going on there. Some African stuff we need to get back into. So for me, my transformational growth was tied to replacing Western misinformation with African and African-American historical, cultural, philosophical, economic, political, social, and spiritual truths. But it was also based on a spiral system of transformation that has stages and steps and degrees. And it's a constant process of work while you're doing everything else. And when you work on this one, it's like cultivating the weeds in the garden. Things start to grow. And if you really cultivate your health along with it, the older you get, the better it gets. I know that some of my older friends had a saying, old age is the shits. And I've always been old even when I was young. You know, my father called me uncle when I was a year old. He told my mother, he said, look how serious he is. He called me Uncle Bill. So I had a childhood, don't get me wrong. I enjoyed myself, but I always had this old thing within me. So going back to these old roots are important. But when you reach a certain age, if you haven't cultivated your growth, then you grow even more. I mean, if you're an athlete, you can only go so long. You become a coach. But if you're doing the kind of work that some of us do, it may be intellectual, it may be artistic, and a number of these things, you flower and grow. The older you get, it gets better. You know what I mean? But it's all working on yourself, the foundation. And the foundation's your identity. We got all these spiritual powers. But if we don't really love ourselves fully, know ourselves fully, then we're not going to be drawing from them in the way we should and in the way we could. And I'm going to tell you something. You see me wearing glasses here. It gives you foresight. You can see way ahead, and it gives you hindsight. You can see way behind, and you can handle the situation you're in right now, but you understand this is microscopic compared to everything else because it positions you for the future. Living in the moment, I'm a live in the moment person. I enjoy every minute of this life, and you should. And of course, I've told you as a warrior, my greatest enjoyment is a fight, but that's me. But the key thing is, when you have nurtured this identity, keep working on it, then that's where the flowers come. That's where the fragrance comes. That's where the growth comes. And it changes your philosophy. It changes how you think. It changes how you relate to yourself, how you see yourself, how you relate to others, and your relationship to nature and the cosmos. And that's also what African philosophy does as well. Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom is a part of it. The system, the Sixfold Stages for Mental Freedom, while it draws from the rich history of our past, it could not come out of ancient Kemet because they didn't have these kind of circumstances it had to deal with. We had to create that here. Since we're creative people, it ain't hard to do. So I'm proposing for the viewers that we launch a webinar, probably it'll be in a month or two, we'll figure out the time soon, that would be a 12-month webinar that could be offered either once a month or twice a month. That's for you to determine. It would be for 2 hours for each of these offerings, 2 hours. And we'd be using some PowerPoint. I know people have asked me to use it for the show. There'll be some PowerPoint that we'll use to make some points in this. It will be centered around the sixfold stages to mental freedom, spiritual and physical freedom, and people locating where they're at and then working on that. We have a process for that. And that is not the process of just information. It's a transformative process that you have to experience. So this could be either twice a month or once a month for at least 2 hours. Half of this webinar will be a presentation. I'll do half of a presentation for 1 hour. Half of it will be interactive. My team, including myself, I'll be working with you as well. 4 of us will break our group down. We need a minimum of 30 to 40 people to start this. And so if we have 4 people at 40, then 10 for each person when we break into the small webinars. That's a good thing about the internet. We can do that. And that will be the interactive part where we get into interaction. And this is, you'll see how this works when we go through this. This has to be 12 months because it's a transformational process. And the way I've worked this in organizations, Pan-African People's Organization, we have used this. It was an 8-month process, but it was every week for 2 to 3 hours, every week for 8 months. And we take people through this. So it takes time for people to go through this. And that's the reason for the time. So a lot of people are used to quick fixes. Transformation is not a quick fix. Transformation is a beautiful process. It's work. It's growth. It's a lot of things. So that's how this would work. The key objective is, 1, to work on inner transformation that is used in the community. In other words, we'll have ways in which this can be applied, not just to yourself, but to others. And that was the brother's point. He was raising the point of healing the community, just not us. But the healing for the community starts with each of us. So there's going to be an interactive process within this. This show is free, but I think you should already realize, and I've been paying for this show, and it's been costly, and I'm going to pretty much have a little donate thing come up. So if you want to make a little donation to offset my costs, because you can only do this so long without getting a little help. People are buying some books, but not enough, not at this point. We have to build the following for that. So there will be a fee for this. The fee will be minimal. But if you think that an awakening experience is important, if you think transformation and growth is important, but you're not willing to pay for it, but you'll pay for miseducation, you'll pay, maybe you won't, but a lot of our people will pay for those Michael Jordan shoes, or they'll pay for a concert where they're paying $100 to hear whatever they hear. I'm going to a show tonight for Juneteenth, the Ronnie Stewart West Coast Blues Society. Anybody from the Bay Area might want to come to that. It's going to be between 6 and 9 p.m. And it's going to be at 2534 Mandela Parkway in Oakland, 2534 Mandela Parkway. And they're going to have some barbecue, but they're going to be playing some good music. And it's free, by the way. There's no charge for that one. So you can get in free. But for this one, there's going to be a minimal fee, probably around the range for each class. And we haven't decided on this, but it's going to be in the range of about $30 a class. And that's going to cover our costs. The people who are helping me, they'll get a stipend for their work. So they would do it for free. Anything that's worthwhile, you should be prepared to put something out for it. And I'm not doing this show to make money off webinars. I'm not going to make much money off of webinars. I'm not interested in that. And I'm not interested in going for corporate sponsors. And the kind of analytics I see right now, corporate sponsors will want this show because it's the right age group. It's all over the world. It's growing. You know what I mean? So I know I'm not really looking for that. If I get put in a bind and I don't get any support, well, then that's a different story. So that would probably be the way that goes. But you know, the key thing is we're in a period of breakdown of families, breakdown of communities, breakdown of nations globally. And so the goal is to use the healing that's worked out in this webinar on freeing the mind, spirit, and body to work things out in our community. And there's other things that I'm doing around community organizing that will assist in this. And there's a lot of things people are already doing. I know people who are watching this show, some of you are in groups. You're doing things already. And so you can bring that to the table. And you're already bringing your consciousness in. So that's what this show's about. This is the main reason for this. And this is also why I did not want to do a show that would be repeating the classroom experience at San Francisco State. No, this is different. And this one here, this enables us to get into internalization. People going through this, they're not going to get a grade. There ain't no grade. It's transformation that we're looking at. You'll get a copy of this curriculum for Parang. You'll get a copy. That will be a part of what you receive. And there'll be other things that will be materials that will supplement this, that will help you. But it's essentially our system that we use through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Now, before closing this and getting into some comments here, and the key thing is I'd like for people who are doing the chat, let me know, are you interested in this? Number one, let me know, put that up there. How often would you like to do this? Twice a month, once a month? You have any ideas on some of the things that you'd like to cover? But essentially, we have a system that we're going to be covering. But underneath this, it's community revitalization, strengthening families, extended family communities, through strengthening our people and strengthening nations, African nations, Caribbean nations. And Africans in the diaspora in Europe, they're in similar circumstances to us. So that's it. For people who do not, who are not on the chat, then you can contact me through my email, otshaka@sbcglobal.net. And I'm going to have my computer person post this on underneath the site for this show that shows when this show's over, which some people are watching now. And so you can have a way to contact me through my internet, otshaka, O T'Shaka, my name, at S as in Sam, B is in Bill, C is in Carrie, global.net. And you can also let me know if you're interested in this. So this is it. This is a way of radicalizing YouTube and Facebook. And producing some change on the air. You know what I mean? We used to go to Marcus Bookstore for this. You still need to go to Marcus Bookstore, oldest Black bookstore in the country, or whatever bookstore is in your community. But also, this has become a site for awakening. You've got a number of awakening sites on YouTube, Facebook. So, and I support all of them. So that's it, Hotep. So what I want to do now is get into comments, and where I see people saying they're interested, what you need to do is contact me and give me your information, how to contact you. That's what I need so I can follow up on you. Deborah June, she says, I'm interested, preference twice a month to maintain momentum. I think I favor twice a month. And the reason is you need more time for depth. Once a month is a minimum. I favor twice a month. And again, it would be not obviously on Saturdays, at least not at this time. We'd have to pick a time that's convenient for people. And then we're dealing with time zones. Some people on the East Coast, Midwest here. And then some people are on the African continent or in the Caribbean, because I've got some people who are coming from different places. So we'd have to adjust this so it's suitable for time zones. We have to work that one out. One of my favorite people, Brother Adis, I have been waiting for this my entire adult life. I know that sounds odd, but I have been feeling like I needed this for a long time. Thanks. Well, this is one of our serious people that has comments on everything, every show and stuff. So you all are the hardcore right in here. Robin Hughes, she's interested once or twice a month is fine. Alama Earthia, I'm interested. Wolf Manlu, probably a lot more than 40. Yeah, that might happen, meaning a lot more than 40 people. Again, Alama Arthea, so glad I found this channel. I'm so glad we found you. Stephen McKenzie, I'm interested. Wolf Manlu, what about sponsorship from wealthy Blacks so the Blacks aren't, for those Blacks that aren't able to pay, can attend? Yeah, if somebody wants to sponsor somebody, fine, that's good. You don't need to be wealthy to do that, you know. If we do it twice a month, then that would end up being $720 for a year, $60 a month if it's at 30 or 40, 80, whatever. But yeah, there ought to be ways to compensate people who can't afford it. But I'm going to say this, the majority of our people should be able to afford this. This isn't a whole lot. And the main thing is, don't let price hinder you. It's not like we're charging a huge amount of money. We're not. The goal is not the money. The goal is transformation. So let's see what else we have here. Okay. Robin Hughes made a comment, something old, something new. And then Brother Adis again, Auntie Africa, yes, 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 so true, Robin Hughes. I have 3 great aunties that are all over 100 years young. Right on. The Black Arts Movement, this is Auntie Africa. The Black Arts Movement is in dire need today among young artists who are still thinking white aesthetics and techniques and simply placing Black figures inside of it. Yeah, And one of the things I want to do on this show is have Sonia Sanchez, Skia Muhammad Toure, Haki Madhubuti, and a number of other leaders of the Black Arts Movement, a brother named Dengani Jogan Calvas, who was chair of San Francisco C.O.R.E.'s Educational Committee and published the first Black Arts Movement magazine, the Journal of Black Poetry. I'd like to have others on for a series on the Black Arts Movement so that they could share what they accomplished with that movement, but then have a dialogue with them and some of the young hip hoppers and others who are into new Black arts of various forms and have a dialogue. So that's something that I want to do and will do. So Brother Adis, I have a plan for everything. Whoa, that is powerful and explains so much about our community and the stage it's in. Brother Adis, again, The Dead Are Arising by Les Payne. Yeah, that's the name of his book. A great book. Read it, by Les Payne. Read it. Wolf, Man, Lou, anything as long as the white is inside, it's what their teaching does. Yeah. Again, Brother Otis, Seba is going to be a powerful contribution to our ancestral development. Yeah, I think so, because we got to break the mold and do it our way. We see the whole thing about I'm a revolutionary. So most people think, oh, I'm about overthrowing the system. Oh, it ain't going to happen in your lifetime. Oh, a lot of people are going to die. My systems are about change that you can use right now, all of them. Sixfold stages to mental freedom. It occurred in the course of change, making change, but it's a part of your life. And it's the same thing with the SEBA system, all these other things. We talked about the twin lineal family system. I mean, you know, we need to repair and rebuild families. That's a model. Those are things you can use now, not just in the pie in the sky 100 years from now. And that's what ensures that if you produce societal transformation, it's deep because it starts with people and then you've applied it in transforming society. See if we have some other stuff here. James Burris, I feel the Nine Bows is like the movie Life with Martin Lawrence and Eddie Murphy. James Burris, unjustly charged for murder and had to stand on bottles because of racist rhetoric. Sun Temple, thank you. I believe that this is the beginning to our walking on the road to complete consciousness and freedom. Yeah, what I can say is, and I really want to stress this, people who have gone through the sixfold stages of mental freedom never talk about healing, never, never, because whatever internal issues they worked on. It doesn't mean they don't have problems, they do. Doesn't mean that they don't have issues they have to address, whether it's with them, their family, whatever, they do. It doesn't mean they're perfect, they aren't. It just means that this is fundamental healing. I'm telling you, this stuff is fundamental healing. James Burris, I'm sorry, Professor, I grew up as a bad student to the white folks. I apologize, sir. There's nothing wrong with that, you know what I mean? James Burris, awoke, nice. Love it. Okay, let's see if there's anything else here. Anti-Africa. There are brilliant elders who were excluded from African-centered cliques. Still many are doing the work. That's true. And we need to identify them and draw from them, because some of the most brilliant are the ones that we know nothing about, you know, that's very true. And that's true on all levels. You know, you see great musicians, there are some out there you've never heard that are even greater, you know. Sun Temple, blessings to you. Oba T'Shaka, I believe that Black families need to be cultivated in consciousness at the beginning as children, and then the vast majority will never become lost or misled. Yeah, true. And we've always had holes in this due to slavery, due to all the kinds of breakups that occurred there, even though we maintained two-parent households for 100 years, 75%, we still had problems with some of them. But I think the key thing is whether or not these young people get love. The key thing. It's a lot of other things. Love is the key thing. And if that's missed, everything else is missed. And those who fall through that crack are in real trouble. And since the post-68 period where drugs and everything else has hit us, that has been a real problem, a real problem. And so we have to come up with a bunch of different ways to deal with that. These young people need as much caring and love and compassion and understanding as possible, while also listening from them. James Burris, I do not belong to no organization or gang. I'm just a person who wake up with a dark skin every day and live the struggle. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, brother. You know, the majority of our people belong to no organization. I already dealt with Brother Otis' point about some elders have arrested development. Lao Tzu, Dr. T'Shaka, as we build organization going forward, how do we make them resistant to destruction or co-optation by hostile forces? Oh, that's a real good one. There are many dangers that our organizations face in organizing. Of course, just building the organization and keeping it going and reaching out to as broad a group of people in our community as possible. So one danger is being knocked off. That is, the government comes in and attacks you, tries to destroy you. That's one. Another one is co-optation that Lao Tzu has just put forward. And these come in different forms. Money, sometimes the ego, sometimes sex, a lot of different ways, co-optation. So the key thing, and this is where the transformation of consciousness is so key, that when you have people who are dedicated to something higher than themselves, which is ultimately the truth, but it's their people, it's to a cause for liberation and transformation. When you have people dedicated to a higher cause, it's very hard to co-opt people like that. I recall in Malcolm's case, after he had been removed from the Nation of Islam, partially through the policies of the Nation of Islam, partially through manipulation of the FBI. We went through this. We talked about Malcolm. The FBI then approached him, and they figured he was vulnerable now because the nation had kicked him out. He'd be angry. So give us some dirt on the messenger. Help us out in doing the nation in. And he basically told them they could go back to hell. So while he was hurt by what the nation was doing, at the same time, he couldn't be co-opted. So it's got to do with the values of your members. It's got to do with both the moral qualities, and it's got to do with the consciousness that's internalized. And it's got to do with whether or not they value their people more than money. And that's a basic value transmitted through African-American culture, now under attack through dead presidents, a lot of us being committed to dead presidents more than anything. So the shifting of values away from negative to positive in this transformative process is key. One thing we did in Pan-African People's Organization, through the orientation process, we created a solid wall. So it's very hard to infiltrate us. I'm not saying we weren't, you never know. And if you're above ground, you have to assume you will be. But if we were, they couldn't do anything with that. And a key thing also is make sure your organization is made up of committed, conscious people who you help develop and grow through a transformational process, but smart people. Make sure your people can think for themselves. This is real key, because one way that the system can play on you is they will play on your weaknesses, and that's a weakness, you know. And they will play on other weaknesses as well. So we have a lot of groups that have not been co-opted. So it's not that it's an impossible thing to do, but co-optation is sometimes more deadly, more dangerous, and more effective than just going in and shooting people. Lao Tzu, I heard Dr. John Henry Clark state that Abraham Lincoln was not necessarily opposed to slavery and would have preserved the institution if he could have discovered source that supports this assessment. Abraham Lincoln was opposed to slavery in that he was anti-slavery, but he was not opposed to it to the point that he was an abolitionist. So, and he would have never been elected president had he been an abolitionist, but that's neither here nor there. So he did not commit himself prior to the Emancipation Proclamation to any action that would end slavery. And in fact, even though he was announced as an anti-slavery candidate, he made sure that when he ran for president, when he got elected, that he would not dismantle slavery. And he made it clear that the war was not fought to end slavery. It's only when they had to issue emancipation. So yes, he would have preserved the institution of slavery had he been able to bring the South back into the Union and in the war. Had the South agreed to that, and the only way they would have agreed to that is an early military victory. Had McClellan been a forceful general, he could have brought that about. And if he did, slavery would have continued for some time after. How long after, that's another story. So yeah, he was right in that sense. Let's see what else we have here. James Burroughs, I would like to get more information on the 60s. Black people minds was for free. Please elaborate. Okay, I hope that you got it in more of what I went through. Not everyone underwent the transformation of consciousness that I'm talking about. Some did. So there were levels of transformation of consciousness. Some people had greater self-confidence. Some people had greater pride in themselves. Some people had a greater sense of self-respect. So there were levels in this. But some underwent deep transformation. That required work. They had to work on themselves. And it required them following this path because it wasn't laid out. But that's usually how change occurs anyway. It's not laid out. You engage in struggle, and then you produce change. So how was this laid out? Look at how Malcolm underwent his transformation. I've explained mine. There are a number of others that went through this. Read Assata Shakur's biography, and she explains in part hers. That's a classic, by the way. Assata, that's a classic work. And then look at the works of people, and you'll see it. The Black Arts Movement. Look at the quality of what they were producing. That will show you consciousness. Look at the writings that came out. That will show you consciousness, But I know what you mean. You're talking about whole people. Robin Hughes said, remember to hit the likes button and the subscribe button. Lao Tzu, Dr. T'Shaka, are you familiar with the thesis that Denmark Vesey's rebellion was a conspiracy to creators being the white settlers as a means of destroying the economic impact of Africans there. No. And I studied the Vesey Rebellion, and the Vesey Rebellion was not a idea of whites. Whites lived in absolute fear that that could happen. And the way in which it was organized, that's the way in which secret societies organized, decentralized, and in small units. So you could never, if Vesey was captured or anybody else, nobody knew everybody that was involved in the organization. So that's not true. And I studied this in depth. That's bunk, pure bunk. This comes from Vesey, who had been enslaved, was on a ship that stopped in Haiti. He got to see the conditions in Haiti. Then he comes to the United States. He wins his freedom through a lottery, and then begins to boldly organize people on the surface, just being bold. And he used the AME church as his meeting place. And the minister of that church left town because he knew a rebellion was coming off, but he allowed that church to be used. And he used a lot of Christian stuff to justify the rebellion. And then he had a voodoo priest, Gula Jack, who was straight out of Africa, who used African systems to convert house Negroes into field Negroes or field Blacks. And so he had a highly elaborate system. And it was one that really threatened the institution of slavery. It was the best organized slave rebellion in history. Wolf, Manlu, we can keep secrets, but we have been indoctrinated to give the Amu all. Yeah, some of us run our mouths too much. Revolutionary matron, I'm glad that you added more context to this conversation. We should all talk about it and understand what it actually means. Yes. Yeah, I would like to get more comments from people just through this and in other ways. So when you go to the site where this show is, proposing the webinar, blah, blah, then put on there your comments, make in-depth comments, and you'll get response from me. That's one way. And then we can contact you. Contact me through email. We can talk in other ways. OTSHAKA@sbcglobal.net. Wolf Manlu today, June 19, 2021, is our emancipated from those spiritual chains which we willingly keep being held by. Yeah. And again, it's talking about this shows the African goddess. Yes. The rest are good mornings and stuff. Okay, so I enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. So contact me and let me know if you're interested in this webinar, and we'll be talking more about it later on.